Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Thousands of people are descending on Cape Town this week for the annual Mining Indaba, one of the industry's largest annual global gatherings. While their attention is surely focused on key issues impacting the mining sector, I doubt any of them would argue with the assertion that politics, whether it be geopolitics or national level issues, is one of the driving forces impacting the industry today. And while playing host to the Indaba, South Africa is also a country where politics and mining have been deeply intertwined for nearly a century and a half. We're joined today by Simon Freemantle, who I believe is one of the most thoughtful commentators on South Africa's political economy. In his role as Standard Bank's senior political economist, Simon's weekly newsletters are a must-read among the investor and political analyst community. Simon has been ranked by Financial Mail as South Africa's top political analyst for 10 consecutive years, and he is a frequent speaker at institutions like Oxford and NYU Stern, and he is a regular presence in South African and international media. I should note that this conversation was recorded a week prior to the announcement that the leader of South Africa's official opposition Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, would not stand for re-election as party leader. Otherwise, this would certainly have featured in our conversation. Of course, if you enjoyed this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. We are pleased to welcome Simon Freemantle to Earlylands in Conversation. Simon, thank you very much for joining us today. Where are we catching you at? In the lovely Mother City, I hope?
Indeed, yeah. Pleasant weather outside, gentle breeze, which at this time of year is good because it can be a lot less gentle around the summer in the Cape.
Cape Town, I think it's on everybody's must-visit list. So, as I've told you many times, I think you're living the dream, my friend, in one of the world's most fascinating countries and in one of the world's most beautiful cities. So, let's get into it. And we've got a lot to talk about today, and these are gritty political questions. You are living South African domestic politics every day. You publish a newsletter and you give briefings that I know are highly sought after and looked forward to by people because you keep your eyes on both the 30,000 foot and the 2,000 foot level of South African politics. And you have just come out with your 2026 sort of lay of the land around South Africa. There's so much in there to unpack. The government of national unity, of course, which everyone is following its progress. I think people are happy that it exists, right, in some form. But in your most recent state of the country, you assigned a 65% possibility to the GNU survival through this year, 2026. But you're actually pretty pessimistic about it actually strengthening or becoming more functional. What do you think it would take to move from this kind of tactical tolerance between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition, to a genuine coalition, with binding agreements, proper dispute resolution, right? Not just lurching from crisis to crisis. What would it take?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an important place to start. You say that GNU is seen as a good thing. That isn't entirely true. I mean, certainly amongst the investor community, amongst the centrists in both major political parties within it, and across the public in South Africa, surveys are showing that roughly half of South Africans see it as effective, either very effective or somewhat effective. So there is still a significant portion of the country and groupings within the key political parties in these arrangements who are skeptical, either because they would prefer another arrangement or there is just so much historical, ideological antipathy in a way between the two major parties in the GNU. They're just so unaccustomed to working together, so that in itself creates its own frictions. However, sentiment is supportive enough of the GNU, and the majority in both the ANC and DA see it as a necessary, or at least a tactical advantage for them. And the international community and the investor community is solidly behind it. And that's a big incentive for the GNU to hold together. What would make it stronger? I mean, it was formed in a very short period of time. I mean, coalitions in Europe take months. This took, our constitution gives a very narrow window of time for parties to agree something after an election. And they did remarkably well to come up with what they referred to as the statement of intent. Now, if you go back to that statement of intent, if you actually implemented it, you would have a fairly robust coalition, but it isn't really being referred to, at least between the key parties, as the way that they're navigating this partnership. So what would help is if they went back to that statement of intent and looked to formalize it. So how do we formalize that statement into an actual agreement? And, there are European countries that are very practiced in this coalition building, and we could follow those examples, whether it's Spain or Germany or various others, to see what kind of coalition agreement is possible when you have two parties that disagree on a lot, right? So you're not going to agree on everything, but what's the framework that we can cooperate? And very importantly, and this is possibly the most important thing, you need a dispute resolution mechanism. They agreed something called a clearinghouse mechanism, which is a very loose and impractical arrangement. And there's 10 parties in the GNU, and under this clearinghouse, all parties have one vote, which doesn't make sense. Larger parties need to have more of a say. So they got to go back to that, build in a proper dispute resolution mechanism, form a coalition agreement. And then, as a last point, the ANC obviously lost power. They went to 40%. But for much of the time since the elections, they haven't really accepted that reality. They accepted it in a very remarkable way in saying, we're not going to fight the results. We're going to form a coalition government, and that strengthens South Africa's democracy. But in effect, many ANC leaders still see themselves as the leading party. They have such an embedded muscle memory of being the governing party that they operate very often without taking proper consideration of the DA's views or the Patriotic Alliance's views. And so the ANC has this idea, for example, that they can control foreign policy, that the DA shouldn't necessarily have a voice in the articulation of foreign policy. And when it comes to coalition government, that's not really realistic. So I think the ANC will have to unlearn that. We'll have to make more effort to be properly consultative, and the president too. The DA, for its part, has its own muscle memory of just opposing the ANC. And so it's seen very often in the coalition as being an opposition within government, and that's not helpful. So they both need to work on that pattern of behavior. But I think the foundation for a more effective alliance is definitely that agreement that needs to be struck.
About the ANC, about the muscle memory, the knee-jerk reaction from both sides, from the opposition and the ANC. Yeah. But on the ANC, I mean, it seems that, the narrative about South Africa and then the polling and the election results for 15 plus years since Mbeki's fall and Zuma's rise, we're coming on nearly 20 years now, has not been one of ANC success. I struggle sometimes to understand how the ANC still feels and members who were not part of the liberation struggle, are 35, 40 years old now, why they seem to feel as if there's an entitlement when it has been such a period of underwhelming governance. Where does that sort of entitlement comes from when you're not talking to someone who was on the front lines in Soweto or in Khayelitsha in 1986, right?
Yeah, I think, on the one hand, the ANC is incredibly good at diagnosing its own problems. This is not a party that is sending the message that all is well. Every senior leadership meeting of the ANC, the statement that emerges from it, and this has been the case for the past 8 years, really, under the Ramaphosa
That's a good point.
Has been one of crisis, one of a loss of direction. The ANC's National Executive Committee met this past weekend and came out and said, our imperatives are for organizational renewal, for accountability, because we've lost our way. And many senior ANC leaders speak very openly about this sense of this real crisis within the party. So there is that acknowledgement. And I think that is a clear element of the ANC's narrative. However, I think the problems within the ANC are such that it makes the organization almost incapable of proper renewal, proper reform. So you can diagnose the problem, but there's a challenge in fixing it. But when it comes to the question you've asked, I think it's less to do with entitlement. I think that's a loaded word in the South African context. It's got more to do with the reality that the ANC is still the party with by far the largest share of the vote. Yes, they've fallen precipitously, but they had 40%. The next best was the DA at 20%, and everybody else other than the MK party was sub 10%. So they still have that, right? And in certain provinces, Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga or Limpopo, they are comfortably the majority. So there is some legitimacy to that in a sense. They do carry more public support, at least electoral support, than any other party. But I also think it's just embedded in, you join the ANC, you join a movement which is representing the people in a broader way than any other party. And even if the evidence is starting to chip away at that, I think it takes a long time for people's understanding or appreciation of that reality to really sort of dawn on them. And I think we're in that interregnum now.
I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about the man at the top, of course, President Ramaphosa, the man with one of the hardest jobs in the world. You identify local government, police, and security reform as two areas where Ramaphosa has been most deficient. And this is where I think, poll results, people will say they are dissatisfied with their local government. They're dissatisfied with their sense of security. And you point that out as really where Ramaphosa has been deficient. As he enters what you call his final 2 years as the ANC leader, do you see any evidence that he's prepared to take on these fights more directly? And I'm thinking here of somebody like Lyndon Johnson in the U.S. in the 1960s. He took these deep structural issues, particularly around civil rights. He used his amazing political skills and his muscle and coercion to make real change, to spend that political capital and get real change. Do you see Ramaphosa willing to do that on police and security reform, local government, or just the broader issues? When are we going to see him truly take risks?
Ramaphosa is a certain type of leader. I mean, a laissez-faire approach would be, I think, the most academically appropriate way of viewing how he intervenes.
I like that.
He doesn't use much of his direct authority, certainly not in a kind of punitive or threatening way. And that creates a lot of frustration because South Africa has, as you know, many breakdowns and crises that need, our feeling, and you see this everywhere, is when we feel we're in a state of crisis, we need to feel that there's strong leadership. And very often our inclination is for that strong leadership to be quite forceful, quite authoritarian. He is not that. He just does not have that in his leadership wheelhouse. But that doesn't mean that he's not effective. I mean, in various areas over the last 8 years, he's been highly effective. It's just taken longer than people would have liked. It's been anchored on due process. It's been framed according to the political realities that he faces. So I think that we need to guard against the expectation that he's going to change his style, even though there's 2 years left. And, we might assume now that he's unshackled from some of those constraints, he's not looking to be reelected. The economy is performing slightly better. There's a better political kind of basis for reform now. I don't think it's going to mean that he'll change the way he approaches leadership. And so, in one sense, no, I'm not expecting a new sort of presidential approach to these issues. However, there are some factors that give me cause for some optimism in these areas of deficiency. On police, we're in the midst of an inquiry into police corruption and the infiltration of organized criminal networks in the senior structures of the police. And that should wrap or conclude sometime in the next sort of 3 to 6 months, hopefully more 3 than 6. The president will be given a report. He's committed to making it public. Alone, that should introduce the potential, the probability for a reshuffle of senior leadership at the police. And I've been calling for that for the last 10 years. That's absolutely essential to any turnaround in police performance. So that, I think, can happen. And it doesn't require him to take real risks. He's implementing the findings of the credible commission. And that's a pattern of his executive behavior over the course of time as well. On local government, again, I don't think we're going to have very dramatic changes this year. In fact, there's possibility that things could get slightly worse in key areas as the current coalitions fear that they're about to lose power. The rent-seeking efforts might accelerate. The ANC is genuinely terrified of losing more power in the big cities, and that is inspiring some changes. I mean, you'll be in Johannesburg soon. You'll probably see it looks slightly better than the last time you were there. There was the G20 meeting. The elections are approaching, but also the ANC is implementing some qualification standards for mayoral candidates. That's new. That's important. But I think more broadly, the DA, which has its own imperfections, no doubt, but they're better at governance and they have an opportunity to take a bigger share of power in the big cities. And that could offer us the opportunity for a governance improvement beyond the next elections, which will only be at the end of this year.
Sure. That's a very nice summary and, takes us beyond some of the more breathless, op-ed headlines. Answer this very simple question, but a highly complex answer is probably what's appropriate. But how solid is Ramaphosa's authority? I think there's this narrative now of him loose and flapping in the winds. But when he does sit around that table at an ANC National Working Committee meeting or a cabinet meeting, How much authority does he really bring to the table?
So he's done exceptionally well to consolidate his authority. I mean, he was elected in 2017 with a very slim majority, and
That's right.
with people in the ANC's leadership who were actively hostile to him and seeking any manner of ways to trip him up. Then when he was re-elected in 2022, the National Executive Committee rebalanced, and since then, many of his most strident adversaries have now left the party and have joined Jacob Zuma's party, the MKP, which has helped Ramaphosa inside the ANC. So inside the ANC, I think right now he has a fairly strong level of authority, but you alluded to it earlier. He's in his final 2 years as ANC president. He could still serve effectively another 3.5 years or so as state president. But once he loses the ANC president, his functional power will have largely disappeared. So he has those 2 years left. Now, there is one narrative that as you reach that end, people within the party are going to look to mobilize behind other authorities that may have a chance of taking over. And so I think the rebalancing will start to happen more like next year than this year. But right now, when the NEC meets, it's a fairly and very welcomingly boring affair relative to the kind of internal factionalism that he used to have to face in his first 5 years.
That's a nice way to put it, a welcomingly boring affair. So the succession question is the one that everyone is wondering about, right? And so you hear about Paul Mashatile as a front runner, so to speak, or you hear about Toko Diziza or Patrice Motsepe. How should we think about succession right now? You're probably not going to want to say who is going to win. I think that's a fool's errand. But how should we think about ANC succession as we lead into elections and the twilight years of Ramaphosa?
Yeah, I like the way you framed that question because it is the right way. It'd be a fool's errand to guess. I mean, the best pollsters in America were not telling us,
of course,
accurately what was going to happen in the last couple of elections. So, if they can't do it, then with far less data, it would be difficult for us to. But how should we think about it? We should think about it, I think, in one major way. One is, are we going to get a succession outcome that allows a level of continuity on this very important, although fragile, recovery that South Africa is currently undergoing? I mean, we're in the midst of a very gradual economic recovery. We're starting to see some institutional recovery in a meaningful way. And that's enormously important for the longer term. Will the ANC succession outcome allow that to continue, or will it disrupt it? And that's the key question that we sit with. The investor community is generally of the view that Paul Mashatile, if he were to win, would disrupt the momentum. And when I ask investors locally and abroad what they see as the biggest medium-term risk, that's what they focus on. They say if Paul Mashatile were to win, that would have a number of consequences. And I agree with this narrative in general. It could reconfigure the GNU. The DA has been open in its opposition to Mashatile and may not be willing to work in the GNU with him at the helm of the ANC. So that's one question. If the DA leaves, who replaces them? And what implications does that have for our policy and political outlook? And then the other implication is, what does it mean for ANC support in 2029? Within the ANC, there are many party leaders who worry that if Mashatile were to win, if he's the person on the ballot papers in 2029, the ANC could suffer another dramatic loss of support. And when I say another, they went from 57 to 40 and could now lose beyond that down to, it's highly speculative, but 30, early 30s. And that would place the ANC in an incredibly difficult position. So I think that's the way you look at it. Will you get a continuity candidate, or will you get a candidate that threatens to disrupt what we currently are seeing as some important momentum?
No, I think, you're right. I mean, it's at this point, it's like saying who is going to be the Democratic candidate in the U.S. at the 2028 elections. But before we talk, because I do want to talk about that sort of ANC renewal, but I'm going to throw one at you may not expect. But when you look at the entire South African political leadership landscape, is there anybody who in particular excites you, right? Who you like it when you hear that they're going to speak, that they're going to be in parliament, or they're going to give a speech, or they wrote an op-ed that you particularly look forward to reading? Who kind of moves the needle for you? Somebody to watch?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And in general, one of the major pieces of, one of the most damaging elements of the Zuma era was that it deprived the state of many of these kinds of people. Many left.
Sure.
They were not willing to work in a government of that kind, and even left the ANC actively. And it's taken a long time, and apart from certain government departments and political parties, they aren't able to really attract the talent. So you find a lot of those sort of real dynamic voices in the private sector and civil society or so on.
Right.
And so, that is something that we're going to have to grapple with. And over the longer term, there needs to be more people moving into the political space, I would argue. Within the opposition, I think there are some individuals. I mean, the Cape Town mayor who you've interviewed, I think he's a modern politician. He understands the kind of balance of what the DA needs to be moving into and what it needs to try and detach itself from in terms of the assumptions of the DA. And I think he does that really well. So I think that he's got a bright future politically.
Sure.
Within the ANC, they're not so much sort of light up the room politicians, but there are some highly competent ministers. The Minister of Transport, Barbara Creasy, for example, is doing excellent work in driving a really necessary reform process in the logistics and transport space. That is, of course, very important for our longer-term economic transformation as well. There are some individuals at the more local level as well that I think are worth watching. Within the ANC, there's a couple of younger guys coming up. The head of the ANC's Economic Transformation Commission, Zuko Godlimpi, is bright and engaging. So yeah, I think that there are certainly some individuals that are interesting to watch. Songezo Zibi, who leads Rise Mzansi, I have a lot of respect for as well.
To your point about the sort of young people looking askance at government, when I was at GE in South Africa back in 2014, 15, 16, sort of the dark days of Zuma, we had some wonderful, young, talented South Africans in our leadership programs, late 20s and such. And I would often say, hey, why don't you think about going to work in government? Why don't you go work as a senior civil servant at the Reserve Bank or the Ministry of Transport? And it was universally greeted with horror. Why would I ever want to be part of this government or just government in general? That's not where opportunity was, which just makes me very sad, right? To see that good people viewed a career in public service with such a negative lens. But let's hope that maybe be in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, I think it'll take time. There are government departments that are still coveted. Working in National Treasury is for example,
right. And Reserve Bank, I think, is still
Reserve Bank. But yeah, the presidency under Ramaphosa has built itself out into a highly effective reform coordination unit. And I know some really smart people who work within the presidency and are very engaged and active. And I think that's become a good place to work, a place where you feel you can make a difference.
Right.
But these are islands of effectiveness in a state that has lost a tremendous amount of capacity and therefore its ability to attract talent. I didn't want to skirt the question on ANC succession. I mean, you mentioned some individuals like Toko Didiza, for example, Speaker of Parliament. I think there's a real chance that a proper momentum could build behind her campaign.
Interesting.
It's high time South Africa properly considered, or at least the ANC paid actual, moved with what it's been saying for a long time of the need for greater female representation in senior structures. She's one of the only people currently who served in Mandela's first cabinet. She's
been around. I was just thinking, she's been around forever. Minister of Agriculture. Forever. I mean, she's done everything.
She's from KwaZulu-Natal, which is interesting in the sense that that's where the ANC's main threat is coming from with the rise of MKP, so it perhaps can dilute that growth. I definitely think that there's some credibility to that. Although the ANC still operates in quite a kind of outdated way of you can't launch your campaign until the branches have nominated you, and that's only going to happen in the middle of next year.
Right. And what about the headlines that you increasingly see? I think, what was it, Africa Report? This week had a headline about Patrice Motsepe. What do you think of that?
So my view is that there is definitely some credibility to that, not necessarily that he himself is driving it. I'm not convinced of that at all. But there is a nervousness within the ANC that they don't have the internal candidates that will be capable of really regenerating their support in 2029. And there are a community of people in the ANC who are looking, sort of thinking outside the box and saying, who might we put on the ballot that could regenerate our support, that isn't tainted with the things that we have done wrong for many years? This is not a new thing. Patrice Motsepe's name has been raised. He's very successful in business. He is the head of CAF, the African Football Federation. He owns the country's most successful football team, Sundowns. He has a stake in the Blue Bulls Rugby Club. He has strong ties.
I didn't know that he had a stake in the Blue Bulls as well, huh?
Yes, yeah. Ties amongst the traditional leadership community, ties amongst the Afrikaner community as well. He has so many of the attributes you would imagine for that kind of role. And so I think the narrative has much less to do with him driving it than with people around identifying him as someone that could embolden the ANC's base to some extent, or at least recover some of their lost stature. And also this continuity that I spoke about earlier, rather than a rupture in the path to allow continuity. I think that viable momentum behind his candidacy would only really emerge if inside the current ANC senior structures, if they cannot agree, if the Ramaphosa camp cannot agree on who to support, if they're too divided, then there might be an argument to say, hey, we got to bring someone in from inverted commas outside to unify these camps, to put up a proper challenge to Paul Mashatile. And that, I think, would only really emerge later on in the campaign. So it's not frivolous. People are not making this up, but I think we've got to treat it with caution at this stage.
Sure. Early days. Well, so much of what we've talked about here is about ANC renewal. How does Ramaphosa do it? How does whoever comes next do it? Do you think renewal of the party is structurally impossible? Can the ANC, as it's organized, and like you say, they have such strong organizational heritage and almost handcuffs on how they do things, how they have to do things. As a party, can the ANC renew itself?
So I've argued for many years that it can't, and I've had this debate with many senior ANC leaders as well, and most actually agree with my point. A few do disagree, and the ANC has always been capable of having robust debate, and I think that's a real attribute for the party. But in essence, the reason why I think fundamental renewal, it's not, you see, what many people equate is if they can't renew, then they collapse, and I think that's a false assumption. You can carry on and sort of slide down, which is, I think, what the ANC will, because there's many things that hold the ANC together. There are many factors that will continue to keep the ANC as a dominant political party in South Africa, perhaps not the only dominant one, but a dominant one. But the reason why I think renewal is not possible is that patronage has become such a systematic element of the negotiation and management of political power in the ANC.
It's the currency of politics, right?
It's the currency of politics. Now, this is not novel to South Africa, but during the Zuma administration, it became so much more prolific. And having lost a lot of people who were holding a kind of certain moral standard in the ANC, it became incredibly difficult to then rebuild that. So when you have that and it's become systemic, I think who within the party is going to be capable of leading a proper process of transformation when the party ecosystem at the local and provincial and national level is deriving its value from this patronage opportunities that political access allows you. And then there's this vicious circle between patronage being your defining feature, which then contributes to factionalism, because patronage and factionalism are intertwined. You're going to have a certain value attached to a certain grouping in the ANC, and in party contests, they've become winner takes all at a national level as well as at provincial and local, which means one group goes against the other, the prize being you have access to all the sort of ability to determine the patronage in that area. But the loss of the other faction is obviously devastating.
It's zero sum, right? Absolutely zero sum.
And those divisions then expose the ANC to more electoral loss, because ANC voters don't like to see the party divided. And we've seen that being their biggest deficiency over the years. And so there's this, and then once you lose more support electorally, there's less patronage to distribute, which intensifies the factional rivalries. And I think they're in that loop. While the president and others seem really to be trying to turn this organization around, I just think that it's not going to be able to fundamentally do so for that reason in the main.
I think it's hard to argue against that. I have so many other questions on the domestic front here, but time is limited, and geopolitics and South African foreign policy, I think, is Very much an issue to be discussed. And you argue in your latest piece that U.S. South African diplomatic strains will be less pronounced in 2026 and 2025, largely because the hostility has become normalized. U.S. South Africa is a relationship of enmity, right?
That view I hold to, that this year it's going to be less of a prominent source of anxiety for investors. I'm not
Right.
necessarily
Okay.
saying
That's a
that
good
we're
way
going
to
to
put it.
see,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying that the relationship will improve this year. I think that that's unlikely in general. But investors, to the point that you made, as I say in the report, they've normalized a very high degree of diplomatic stress. This time last year, that had not been normalized. So when the White House issued the executive order against South Africa, accusing South Africa of egregious actions, and there was that line which was very worrying, including the suggestion that South Africa had aided Iran's nuclear program, which, as far as I'm aware, there's no truth to that. But that was very unsettling for investors because nobody knew what might come from that. Sanctions, very steep tariffs. Remember, at that point, the world had not yet sort of rebalanced or become accustomed to this punitive tariff environment as well. So we were in those early stages of that. I think now, on the one hand, when the US issues a statement against South Africa, for example, in December last year on the issue of these Kenyan nationals who've been processing the
Right.
Afrikaner
Yep.
refugee applications, and they were operating in South Africa according to South African government without the proper approvals. The US issued a statement threatening severe action if they were to be deported, and the market didn't move at all. So I think that has happened, and that will help this year in smoothing out the market reaction to a high level of diplomatic instability. The other thing is that the US is, this time last year they had a lot of levers to pull: tariffs,
Right.
withdrawing aid, withdrawing other forms of bilateral support, expelling ambassadors, withdrawing climate funding through the JETP. All of that's been done. And so, in a sense, now you have fewer levers. There are still levers, still sanctions. There are still other things, higher tariffs, etc. But that will help this year, I think. Um, we've also seen that the tariffs haven't had much of an impact. They've had an enormous impact in creating uncertainty, and that uncertainty has affected global growth and has also affected South Africa's growth. But our trade with the US last year was much the same as it was the year before, to a great extent because mineral exports are exempt from
Right.
tariffs. And
Right.
there was an increase in mineral exports to the US last year. And I also think we're no longer the G20 head. I mean, our head was very uncomfortably above the parapet throughout last year. When the Trump
Right.
administration came in and said, we don't like DEI, we think climate change is a hoax, and all of these things, South Africa at that stage was articulating its G20 leadership, emphasizing the need for equality and tolerance and climate redress and so on. And so we were in a soft target as the Trump administration tried to kind of flex the America First policies on the global stage. No longer having that G20 position, I think, probably reduces some of the intensity of that focus. You are far better equipped to speak about how the US President Trump's priorities might shift this year now with the midterms and the like. And I wonder whether that'll have an impact as well on how much time and effort he focuses on
Sure. Oh, man.
South Africa. And
well, this is the stage in the proverbial dinner when my wife would be kicking me under the table saying, you've got to move on or stop nerding out so much on South African politics. But of course, I could do that with you forever. But I want to ask you the hardest question. Give us the elevator pitch, because I know you're a pretty glass half full kind of guy in South Africa. Although you are a very astute critic of what's going on in South Africa, I know you're a glass half full guy. So short and sweet. What keeps you positive about the beloved country?
yeah, look, we are this turning point narrative is gaining traction, and it's not frivolous, it's meaningful. The economy is turning the corner. We are this year or last year we grew at 1.2. That is not enough, but it is more than
Right.
double the year before. This year we think we'll grow at about 1.5. Next year 1.8. Thereafter 2.1. We're in the process of a long-awaited recovery. Not since the Mbeki era have we seen growth improve year after year for a period of time, as we are now expecting to be the case with a high degree of confidence. And that speaks to reforms that are now embedded, right? Structural
Right.
reforms that are becoming
Right.
increasingly embedded, meaning that even a government in 2029 that is much less reliable will find it exceptionally difficult to reverse the unbundling of Eskom and the market liberalization of the logistics sector and the like. So that is a source. Definitely, there's great optimism there. Another factor is the world is undergoing a dramatic democratic backsliding. You read the VDEM report, the International IDEA reports, you look at what's happening in the United States, and South Africa is nudging in the opposite direction. Last year, Afrobarometer data told us that public support for democracy had increased in the last 2 to 3 years relative to an ongoing decline in the preceding 10-year period. We've been upgraded by VDEM to a liberal democracy, where we were in 2011 and lost that status. We are one of only 29, I think, countries in the world that are regarded as liberal democracies. And I would argue that the constitutional democracy is not as imposed from above as many assume in South Africa. It is a sort of living and breathing reality across citizens, across the kind of networks of influence and that exist in the absence of an effective and capable state. And that's what's held us together, and that's what I think will continue to. And within that, you've got religious organizations, civil society, the private sector, ratepayers associations. There's an enormous resilience within that community, coupled with very encouraging signs of some macro reform stability at the top. And for those reasons, I think South Africa is now in better shape than it has been for a long time. And I think there's more durability to this recovery now than there has been at any point during the Ramaphosa era.
That's great, man. I think they should record that and put that on the SAA in-flight video or the Welcome to South Africa when you're landing at OR Tambo. And thank you for wrapping it up on that positive note. Our last question that I ask every one of our guests: what book or books, 1, 2, 3 books, fiction or nonfiction, would you recommend to somebody, particularly somebody who doesn't know SA all that well, has listened to this, or maybe just reads about SA and the FT, but wants to understand more about this absolutely vexing but absolutely wonderful country? What would you recommend that they read?
I mean, I was dreading that question. I knew you were going to ask me.
I mean, there are hundreds of books. You and I could tell each other, right?
So many. In fact, I'm looking at my bookshelf behind my desk right now. I think that there really aren't, single books that can explain the country in composite form. But I would draw a focus to basically anything that Johnny Steinberg has written on South Africa. I think he writes about the South African question in so many different and interesting and nuanced and sensitive ways.
Absolutely. The numbers, for example, about gangs in Cape Town, and it's just
absolutely,
you're right. Brilliant writer.
And his latest book, Winnie and Nelson, which is about the relationship between those two pivotal figures, and the frictions between them are really still frictions that South Africa is experiencing today, which is between someone willing to compromise and someone calling for a much more radical set of changes to an imperfect status quo. These are still questions that we're asking ourselves now, even though there are different people asking them. Not to unravel the positive sentiment we shifted on, but the most remarkable book that I've read recently about South Africa was by Jeff Wicks, who wrote about the corruption that we'd seen at Tembisa Hospital, a public hospital in Gauteng. He wrote a book called Shadow State. And I think to understand what it is that South Africa is grappling with most acutely in that intersection of political breakdown in a way and corruption and the manipulation of political access, that's a very important book. And I hope it changes things in terms of the way that people focus on these matters and the procurement rules that are put in place. It's not an easy read, but I would say it's a very necessary one to understand another element of the South Africa conversation.
Fantastic recommendation. Yeah, the Tembisa hospital scandal is pretty jarring. I'm glad somebody went deep on that. So we'll put those into the show notes. Simon, this is fantastic. I am excited that I'm going to see you in a couple of weeks in Cape Town during the Mining Indaba, and it could be your wife that kicks you under the table to say, can your friend go home so we can not talk about South African politics for a while? I absolutely love chatting with you about this, my friend, and your insights and your analysis, I think, is unparalleled. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Todd. It's been a pleasure.